Hello everyone, and welcome to the MS-DOS project. Today I'll be talking about the next game in the Ultima series, Ultima Worlds of Adventure 2, Martian Dreams. During the 2-year gap between Ultima 6 and Ultima 7, the Ultima franchise was more active than ever. Not only did Origin themselves quickly put out a spin-off in Worlds of Ultima Savage Empire, but they contracted Looking Glass Studios to produce their dungeon crawler and brand it Ultima Underworld. However, Origin wasn't done with just these two spin-offs. Despite Savage Empire only selling about 40,000 copies, they decided to greenlight a sequel in hopes that it might do a bit better. This would eventually become Martian Dreams. The initial idea from Jeff Johanningman for what would become Martian Dreams was pretty basic. Essentially, he just wanted to throw a bunch of Victorian-era characters into one story, but didn't have much more of an idea of what the game would look like beyond that. Luckily, Warren Spector was more than happy to work from that brief, as he enjoyed the idea. Spector said that, quote, "I've always been fascinated by the Victorian era. It was a time of incredible technological progress. Telephones, automobiles, phonographs, movies, all sorts of stuff we take for granted today, started in the late Victorian era. It was also a time when people like Jules Verne were starting to think about the future," close quote. However, it seems that there were differing ideas on what the game would become even from those heading up the project. Jeff George was given an entirely different brief on what the game would be. He said, quote, "I was super excited to be doing a near future, possibly slightly cyberpunk adventure with the Ultima 6 engine. At the time, I was very inspired by the foreseeable future and the exploration and colonization of our own solar system. This was right at the height of the cyberpunk era in science fiction," close quote. Making these quotes from both Jeff George and Warren Spector, it's clear to me that at one point there were two competing ideas for this game. One was the cyberpunk adventure that George described, and the other was the eventual steampunk Martian adventure that we got. Jeff George was not too enthusiastic about this new direction, however, saying, quote, "In all honesty, when Worlds of Ultima 2 became the Victorian adventure Martian Dreams, I found myself leading the development of a game that, in all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been very interested in playing," close quote. Despite not being as interested in the final subject matter, by all accounts he was still very professional and did everything he could to make the project a success. Warren Spector and Jeff George were not the only Origin staff assigned to work on the project. One of the critical additions to the project was Jeff D., who was in charge of designing the individual map tiles, as well as sketching creatures and designing the spaceships the characters would use to travel to Mars. The spaceships in particular were inspired by Jules Verne's novel From the Earth to the Moon, famously adapted in 1902 by French filmmaker Georges Méliès as A Trip to the Moon. Méliès is actually one of the famous figures who appears in Martian Dreams, coincidentally. Another key player in development was Philip Brogden, who was put in charge of creating the world map and then filling it with enemies, friendly characters, and secrets. Brogden's first work at Origin had been on the Savage Empire, writing dialogue and creating NPC schedules. Because of this expertise, he was tasked with doing similar things for Martian Dreams. Probably his largest job was actually drawing up the game map. He based the entire world map off of an actual surface map of Mars created by NASA, and slowly drew in things such as channels and points of interest. Using an external map viewer will reveal that the name Griffin in all caps is carved into the northeastern glacier, which is normally unreachable and unviewable. This was Brogden's nickname, and a fun little Easter egg he hid while building out the world. Generally, development seems to have gone fairly smoothly, as this was the third project on the Ultima 6 engine and a lot of the developers knew it inside and out at this point. Richard Garriott was busy working on Ultima 7, so the small team was mostly just left to it. There are development documents that talk of an early alpha build of the game that would have shown off some of the unique mechanics that would eventually end up in Martian Dreams. However, there's no indication that this version was ever archived or currently exists. Although development was fairly painless, that didn't mean they weren't working up until release time on the project. Brogden later recalled that, quote, "Nothing at Origin was ever really complete until it shipped. Not the story, maps, art, or programming. We always worked on everything right up to the last possible second," close quote. Development documents confirm this was the case, with the clue book having received changes and notes 2 days before release. After a very short development period of around 6 months, the game was released as Ultima Worlds of Adventure 2 Martian Dreams on April 4th, 1991. The observant will notice that the name of the spin-off series changed from Worlds of Ultima to Ultima Worlds of Adventure with this game. I couldn't find any reason for why this was done, so I asked Richard Garriott on Twitter. He replied saying, quote, "I believe it was needed to protect the Ultima trademark." The game itself released a fairly positive critical reception. Roger Stewart of Computer Gaming World said that it, quote, "manages to be accessible to even a relative newcomer while sacrificing nothing in quality of play. and called it an epic adventure. Other reviewers had similar praise, especially for the game's story. Unfortunately, the critical praise did not translate to high sales, as Martian Dreams failed to even match the numbers that Savage Empire did. This ultimately killed the World series and an already in development SNES port of Martian Dreams. Jeff Johanningman later said that, quote, "We hoped that the Worlds of Ultima games would attract a larger audience, all the Ultima players, plus new players who would be interested in the new genre settings. In truth, I think we only got the subset interaction, a small number of already existing Ultima fans who also happen to be fans of each particular setting," close quote. Although the game was considered a commercial failure, it was by no means without any merit. Even though this was considered a cheap game for Origin to develop, they by no means skimped on the physical product. The box has a gorgeous front cover, with artwork of what appears to be two people dressed in Victorian attire observing the red planet from some kind of spaceship. There's also a small sticker that gives a list of hardware requirements, which includes a hard drive. Although I didn't test to see if you actually need a hard drive to play the game, it appears to be the first Ultima game to actually require you to have one in the system requirements. Flipping over to the back, we have an extremely verbose description of what to expect, including gameplay features and locations, as well as a few screenshots. Alongside these, there are some portraits of famous people you will encounter in the game. Inside the box, you will find 3 5¼ floppy disks with the game on it. There's also a paper map of Mars with helpful notations for various locations and cities in the game, which comes in handy when trekking across the Martian surface. Additionally, there are 2 manuals in the usual immersive Origin style, titled Time Travel Use of the Orb of the Moons, as well as Mysteries of the Red Planet. Both of these manuals are written in-universe by Dr. Johann Spector, and yes, he is the stand-in here for Warren Spector. The Time Travel Manual gives bios and historical information on all of the historical figures you will meet in the game, while the Red Planet Manual has information on Mars, its features, and its creatures. There's also a reference card along with some registration and advertising materials. Optionally, you could also purchase a clue book, titled The Last Notebooks of Nellie Bly. All of these materials are also available for free digitally with the GOG.com version of the game, which is also free. Installation of the game is fairly simple. Most modern users will simply install the GOG version either through the Galaxy client or its own standalone installer. The original installation, however, gives you a few interesting options. The installer lets you choose where you want your files to go and whether you want to just uncompress all the files onto the disk and take more space, or let them be loaded in at runtime, increasing load times. It also lets you choose whether you want to use the mouse or not, and while you could play the whole game without using the mouse, there's not really any reason to do so. Next is an option of whether you want to create a new character or not, and although it is a huge pain to have to come to the installer every time you want to start a new character, having the ability to keep these files and uninstall everything else would have been really nice when hard drive space was very limited. The last 2 options are graphics and sound, which of course I set to 256 color VGA and rule on MP32 sound. After all those options are ready, there's a short installation requiring a few floppy disk swaps, and soon the game is ready to start. When you boot up the game, the usual Origin FX intro of the period will play, but this time the planet that comes out of the background isn't Earth, but Mars. From here the game intro plays, and man is it a huge step up from Savage Empire's mostly static screens for an intro. There's still a bit of text to read and get through as we haven't quite hit fully voiced intros yet, but there's a lot more animation and color than before. It's also presented in this fun retro scrapbook style that really works for the period. Essentially, a real-life engineer and astronomer, Percival Lowell, proposes a mission to Mars during the 1893 Columbian Exposition. In this, surely alternate, timeline, he has a fully working space cannon and invites all sorts of leaders, dignitaries, and celebrities of the era aboard to see it before the first launch. However, disaster strikes when an unknown figure lights off the cannon with all these important people aboard. Mostly it sounds like poor security and safeguards to me, but you have to get these Victorian figures on Mars somehow. As a good number of important historical figures are now stuck on the Red Planet, it's up to you to save them and bring them home. There are many questions left to be answered at this point, but the game drops you on the main menu for now. The main menu is very simple with only 4 options, and the first option to run the introduction will tell us much more. Curiously, this does not show us the intro that plays when the game boots up, but a different one that tells us how our character gets involved in the story. If you are unfamiliar with the Ultima series, the player character is very different from most games. Instead of being someone who exists in the fantasy world or that you create from scratch, the player is intended to be directly you from Earth. The player is pulled to other worlds through the use of dimensional gates, and the story progresses from there. This game is no different, starting with you at your suitably 90s computer. And yes, although the intro shows you to be a blonde man, you can also choose to be a woman in character creation. Anyways, you invite Dr. Spectre in, who is definitely not Warren Spector, and are surprised when he tells you that you sent him a telegram urging him to meet you. You tell him you didn't send him one, but before you can figure out what's going on, a mysterious woman approaches from outside with vital information. In the package she hands you is a book on the orb of the moons, a map, and an old picture of you and Spectre with Nikola Tesla and Sigmund Freud. While it isn't entirely clear what's going on, you follow the map to an old forgotten lab built by Nikola Tesla in the mountains of Colorado. You then further follow the Orb of the Moons book, which appears to have been written by Dr. Spectre, to use the orb to create a gate back in time instead of to another world. Of course, knowing the orb can be used to travel in time would be incredibly useful, but don't worry, it only ever comes up in this game and never ever again. After stepping through the gate, you emerge in the same place, only in 1895. When you arrive, Nikola Tesla and Sigmund Freud are there, shocked by your sudden appearance. Why Freud is involved in this isn't really clear, but come on, you couldn't exclude him if you were going to have a who's who of 1895. Tesla believes your story because he reads a letter you were given among the papers, one that appears to have been written by him, although he has not yet written it. Clearly at this point we are dealing with the
bootstrap paradox. Google it.
Although it does beg the question, how did this loop start? Who really got us to travel back in time the first time?
Who really composed Beethoven's Fifth?
The game doesn't answer these questions, of course, because it is a bootstrap paradox, but it is fun to have a setup based on this bootstrap paradox. Once Tesla is satisfied with your story, he introduces you to one of your companions for the game, reporter Nellie Bly. I'll talk about her when I get to gameplay, but for now, the crew is assembled and we can take our own space bullet to Mars. At this point, the intro ends and kicks us back to the main menu. The next option on the menu is Create a Character. This character creation screen is very similar to previous Ultima games, but this time with Sigmund Freud interviewing you instead of a random gypsy. And honestly, I think this was the whole reason the developers had Freud as one of the members of the rescue mission, but I'm not complaining. First, he asks you your name, and then asks you whether you identify with your father and mother more. A really weird way to ask you what gender you want to play as, but if you know anything about Freud's psychological theories, it makes a bit more sense. His last set of questions are the ones that determine what starting stats you'll have. They are much less straightforward than the old 8 virtue questions in the original, and in fact I had to look up a chart to see what the result of picking answers would be. As it turns out, there isn't a huge variance, and your stats aren't actually super important in this game, so I wouldn't stress it too much. After Freud's interview, you are once more unceremoniously dropped back onto the main menu. If at any point you want to make a new character, you'll have to rerun the installer and choose to wipe out your current save file. Luckily, this is the last Ultima game in which we'll have to deal with this, as going forward the rest will support multiple save files. The last two menu options are Continue Game and About Martian Dreams respectively. Continue Game just drops you back into the game, either for the first time or where you last saved, and About Martian Dreams plays the game's credits, which are in fact the exact same game credits that you get when you beat it. Once you finally get into the game, you are basically just dropped right in. Immediately you will notice the user interface. Although it is almost exactly the same as the previous two games on the same engine, it has now been styled to look more Victorian and steampunk to fit the setting of the game. The main largest portion of the screen is the game world, which is pretty straightforward. It also shows dialogue whenever you speak to another person, which is a good way to display a lot of text on the screen at once. The top left of the screen shows the time of day by moving along a little side view of the world and changing the color of the sky, which is pretty clever. The bottom left has tons of levers that you can use to do various actions, everything from combat and conversation to looking at something or moving it around. Personally, I find the design here to be an upgrade over the previous two games on the engine because each lever is labeled with a word describing the action instead of picture icons, some of which could be a bit ambiguous. However, I mostly avoided using the levers entirely, as they all have a corresponding keyboard command, but it is a nice option to have. The upper right portion of the screen is extremely versatile. Most of the time it will simply list out your current party members and their number of hit points. Clicking on a party member, however, pulls up their current inventory and equipped items in this spot, and you can click on the small space button to see their portrait and other stats. One thing to note about inventory in this game is that unlike Ultima 6, the inventory does not scroll, meaning you are limited to 16 items plus whatever you have equipped per character, unless they have a backpack or bag of sorts, which can then act as an additional 16 slots. This makes inventory management even more crucial in this game, so make sure you have enough containers and free slots before trying to pick things up. This same portion of the screen also shows the portrait and name of the person you are speaking to. The bottom right simply shows your recent commands and some other information, but outside of dialogue, this is where most of the text goes. You start out inside the capsule you launched to Mars in, and you can talk with all of the members of your expedition and prepare to face the harsh Martian surface. Of course, we'll ignore all the questions like, how did we propel this capsule to Mars, and how did we survive the crash landing onto the planet without some sort of deorbit burn? Besides Freud, Tesla, and Nellie Bly, there are two others who joined us. One of them is Dallas Garrett, the bodyguard for your expedition. Besides you and Dr. Spectre, he's the only one who isn't a real historical figure on the capsule, and in this case he is the in-game counterpart of Dallas Snell, who worked at Origin at the time. He doesn't have very much to say, but he will give you a crowbar to help you pry open the door to the outside. The other member of the party is the mysterious Dr. Blood. Now, unlike most of the figures in the game, I'd never heard of Dr. Blood before, so I wasn't sure he was real. The manual says Dr. Spectre had never heard of him either, but, quote, despite his checkered past, he proved an able and concerned doctor, close quote. Checkered past. Hold on. Let's see here. Charles Lewis Blood was an American con artist. What does that even mean? So as the article says, quote, though he styled himself Dr. Blood or CL Blood MD and authored a book on medicine, he was widely supposed to be a con artist with no legitimate claim to any medical degree, close quote. So it seems he was kind of a quack doctor who simply administered nitrous oxide and called it a cure-all. Surely that was it. Wait, criminal activities and allegations? Let's see, blackmail, tax evasion, fraud and misdemeanors, murder? Yeah, I guess you could say that was a checkered past. He seems to have somehow usually escaped justice. So, at the very least, he was some kind of legendary con man at best. Despite his actually very colorful history, he does have an important role to play in the game. As we are again away from Britannia in this adventure, we do need some stand-in to heal or resurrect us when things go terribly wrong, and here Blood plays that role. It is kind of appropriate to bring along someone who specializes in, quote, oxygenized air to the Red Planet, though I think I found him less useful than the game tries to tell me. In the back of the ship there are a bunch of supplies you will want to collect, including sets of warm clothing, lanterns and tools, and of course weaponry including guns and ammunition. Ammunition is actually kind of scarce in this game, so it's a good idea to take all of it whenever you can find it. The game still does the annoying thing of dropping everything in a pile when searching a container, meaning that if you want something on the bottom of the pile, you will either have to take or move each item on top of it to get it. Kind of annoying, but it isn't too bad once you get accustomed to dealing with it. Once you are fully equipped and ready to go, you can attempt to pry open the door to exit to the Martian surface. When you try to do so, however, Tesla won't let you leave until he, quote, knows that you are adequately prepared to face the danger ahead. In reality, this is the game's copy protection, but if you have the manuals, or Google, the answers are very easy to find. Once Tesla is satisfied with your answers, you can once again attempt to pry open the door, this time successfully. At this point, Blood will talk to you and tell you that you will need to find a source of oxygen, otherwise all of your physical and mental capabilities will be reduced. And this is true. Without oxygen, your party members will suffer from a reduction of several points in all stats. Therefore, it is helpful to find a source of it on the planet, and how we can do that will be shown in a bit. I will note, however, that I never found oxygen deprivation to be a huge burden in my playthrough, so if at any point a party member runs out, I wouldn't be too concerned. They won't drop dead instantly, as Mars in the game isn't totally devoid of oxygen as it is in real life.
Dr. Blood does offer to make you some oxygen canisters to help temporarily, but as far as I can tell, he just never gives them to you. Like the manual and dialogue all suggest that these canisters actually exist, but I never got them in my inventory and I can't find any indication that they even exist online. Several people have even noted this in their playthroughs, so I think it may have been a last minute cut to the game and thus the dialogue remains.
Once you step onto the Martian surface and begin to explore, you will quickly see that it is not like the Mars we know from decades of pictures and rover exploration. And as much as noted in the manual, with Dr. Spectre wondering how NASA could have missed such obvious signs of life. How this all gets resolved is one of the plot points of the game, so it will be touched upon later. At the moment though, there is lots of flourishing plant life upon Mars, and even the animals all seem to be based upon plants in one way or another. There does however seem to be a lack of intelligent life, a lack which will become even more glaring when you come to your first city that was clearly not built by the explorers that arrived 2 years prior. What happened to intelligent Martians is one of the central points of the game and will drive most of what you do for the rest of the story. For now, however, you will want to focus on making contact with the people who previously landed here, as they stopped sending messages to Earth a while ago.
The game tells you to head to the landing site of the 1893 capsule first, and luckily it is basically due east of where your party landed. You will know when you get there because there is a large trench formed by the landing of the last bullet, which despite 2 years of windstorms and such, seems to be perfectly straight and as it was the moment they crashed. At the old capsule, you will find a bunch of supplies you can take, as well as a man called Dibs, your last permanent party member for a while. He tells you of an outpost nearby you should visit to get equipped. But before I could take up his advice, I ran into a real issue with this game. One of the most discouraging things someone can run into while playing a video game is losing all of their progress. It's especially frustrating when it's not your fault, but the fault of the game. In the case of Martian Dreams, where you only get one save file, this can mean totally forcing you to start over from the beginning. The problem is that there's a bug very early on that can cause your save file to become corrupt, meaning eventually when you go to save, the whole game will freeze up. And in my case of using original hardware, the entire machine will as well. For me, this first manifested right after picking Dibs up and trying to save. Everything just froze when I tried to do so. I thought it was just a regular crash at first, but after hard restarting my 486 a few times and having it lock up upon save each time, I decided to look into it. Turns out I was not the first person to encounter this, and in fact it's pretty common across people playing the game. There have been several attempts to narrow it down, but there appears to be no consensus on what exactly causes it. The best guess is reflected on the Ultima Wiki as such. Quote, a save game seems to reliably corrupt itself if one saves in the area north of 3115 south and east of 158 east unless one had previously saved in the area south of 31 south and east of 158 east at least once sometime before that. A simple solution is to save near Dibs before going north. Close quote. Several people have reported that their game crashed reliably while saving around the 1893 crash site, while others say saving their game there first prevented the issue. As for myself, here's what I appear to have done to trigger it. First, I collected everything inside the capsule, then passed copy protection and opened the door. At this point, I saved before even exiting the capsule at the 1895 landing site. I then saved again after some minor combat, somewhere in the vicinity of 25 south, 168 east. I restored the game after wandering into a more dangerous combat that left my whole party almost dead, and ran back to the 1895 capsule to pick up some more dangerous stuff and got healed up. I saved again at the 1895 capsule, and then beelined it straight to the 1893 site to pick up Dibs. I hadn't saved when we ran into another dangerous combat that killed Nellie Bly, so I reverted and ran to pick up Dibs again, making sure to save right after I grabbed him. And here was the freeze. This behavior seems to have lined up with what user NM observed on the GOG.com forums all the way back in 2015, saying, quote, once the game has become corrupted, the game will freeze upon the third time the game is saved following corruption. Again, unless one saves in the area south of 31 south and east of 158 east before the third save. The third save after a corruption won't complete regardless of location. Here I saved once in a location that was north and east of the boundary, and on the third attempted save it would crash every time. So I reran the installer and wiped out my character, and this time heeded the advice of the wiki, and did not save until I picked up Dibs, as you find him in a quote-unquote safe area of the map. This made the rest of my playthrough smooth and without incident from there on out. So as that appears to be the working solution at the moment, I would recommend doing what I did and dropping your first save by Dibs at the 1893 crash site. If that somehow doesn't work for you, please let me know, as I'd be very interested to see if the workaround is consistent. Getting back to actually playing the game, the next place to head is where Dibs suggested we go, Calamity Jane's trading outpost. It's not too far from the 1893 crash site, however you are likely to face your real challenges here, besides the aforementioned corruption bug. There are many dangerous beasts that lurk around the trading post called sextelligers, which provides me a good opportunity to talk about the combat in this game. Combat works pretty much the same as in Ultima 6 and Savage Empire. Your party fights in the same space as the real world instead of being dropped into a specialized combat screen. By default, you control the behavior of just the avatar, while all of your party members will attack on their own. However, from each character's inventory menu, you can modify how they behave to use melee or ranged combat, flee, or be completely controlled by you as well. A lot of time I opted to just leave the computer in charge of my companions, as most combat became pretty straightforward and simple that way. One thing to note coming from the Savage Empire is that there is a much larger emphasis on guns. Whereas that game had basically one gun you could use, this one has a wide variety of guns, ranging from basic revolvers and rifles to shotguns and a big one called the Elephant Gun. A particular favorite of mine is the Belgian Combine, a gun that can use both rifle and shotgun rounds in either solo or combined modes. This is based on a real type of gun called a cape gun, and while it's not super useful, it is super cool. The guns all seem to behave as you would expect,
with rifles doing more damage and being more accurate at a distance, while shotguns have a spread that can shoot multiple enemies, as well as your party members. I would recommend not giving these to your other party members to avoid them becoming the Ian of Martian Dreams. There are also some fun Martian guns that can be used eventually, including a heat ray and a freeze ray. Both of these basically behave like a shotgun, but do a lot more damage. All of the guns have fairly limited ammo supplies, however, with even the Martian weapons needing to eat radium at a fairly high rate. So for combat against pretty weak enemies, I would recommend switching your party over to melee weapons like knives and swords. Because of this, the combat often felt pretty one-dimensional, just a basic matchup getting close to enemies and slashing them to death, or occasionally shooting the harder ones. One glaring omission from both this game and Savage Empire is the lack of magic in combat. I understand that it would have been pretty tough to substitute magic for something else due to the game being billed as historical fiction, but there's a similar system to magic I wish could have been used for combat. Around the Martian surface are scattered various berries, all of which give you some sort of magic type powers based on their color. These vary from telekinesis to seeing through walls, and some are basically useless. They are required at several points, but they are very situational instead of being a straight up magic system. Because of the lack of a magic system, the intelligence stat is, well, effectively useless. There is some speculation online, along with some lines in the manuals that state it might affect the length of time the berries last, but I haven't really seen any evidence to confirm that, and basically every guide online says to just ignore the stat entirely, which really just has the effect of making the stats in this game less important than they were in any Ultima game, which never really emphasized stats in the first place. Once you've survived your encounter with the Sextelligers, you will finally be able to get to the trading post, where Calamity, Jane, and Buffalo Bill are at. They are really the only major shopkeepers in the game, so you will be visiting this location a lot. The problem at the moment is that their supplier, a man named Cooter McGee, is currently MIA. Calamity Jane asks if you can go check up on him for her, and when you agree, she will have Buffalo Bill give you some berries and something that will help us solve our oxygen problem, a mineral called oxium. These little blue rocks will keep any party member stats at maximum when they have some in the inventory, at the cost of using them up over time. But they are also the primary currency on Mars, so you will have to be very choosy on how you use them. This makes finding and maintaining piles of oxium a key priority for the entire game. Heading over to Cooter's location, you will get your first chance to use the berries I mentioned earlier. In this case, you enter his cave and there's a gap you cannot cross, with a plank that you could use to cross just out of reach. In this case, you use a purple barrier and then move the plank across the gap to be able to cross. This is probably the most frequent use of berries, being used for telekinesis or remote manipulation of objects. Once you cross into his cave, you find that he is just missing. Luckily, Cooter left a handy note to help you find the cave where they trapped him, and upon freeing him from his captors, he will hand you a map showing where he stored his massive stash of oxium, and it's yours to keep. I was relieved to see that in this case of doing an Ultima side task to progress the story, there was a significant reward besides just checking a box and moving further along the plot. While you're exploring the Martian surface, you may wish to get to know your companions a little better. Although there are a few more that you can pick up throughout the game, the main core you have at this point will all be with you throughout, and will never leave you unless they die and you don't get them revived by Dr. Blood. Each of them are useful sources of information, some more so than others. Dr. Spectre mostly just tells you his thoughts on some of the people that accompanied you on the voyage, but he also has some fun stuff to say if you ask him about your past adventure, and some quips about certain events in the game. Even though he's the scientist figure in this game, he doesn't help you manufacture grenades or guns like Raptor did in the Savage Empire, so I have to knock him down a peg for that. However, he is still fun to have around. Nellie Bly, on the other hand, is an extremely useful companion, if not for her baseline combat skills, then for her note-taking. Like Jimmy did in Savage Empire, Nellie takes notes of important events that have happened in the game and what you're supposed to do next. This game in Savage Empire actually had this really clever way to add a notebook feature to the game, and although I didn't use her super often as I was already in the normal Ultima habit of taking lots of notes, she's definitely very useful to have around. I do wish they would have kept this feature around in future Ultima games, as this is the last real time that a quest notebook appears in an Ultima game. Our last main companion is Dibs, who we picked up at the 1893 crash site. Although not as tangibly useful as Nellie Bly, Dibs will tell you all about what has happened in the 2 years since the first expedition landed, as well as about major locations and characters within the game. He does start out with pretty good stats too, so he is an immediately useful addition for combat situations. Each of your companions may also have bits of dialogue from time to time, chiming in during important moments or just minor interactions with certain characters. You can also control them solo by pressing one of the top row number keys, allowing you to have them go loot or do other tasks where you don't want to have the whole party in tow. Pressing 0 will switch you back to party mode where everyone simply follows the avatar in a vague formation. Each character you control, including the avatar, has the chance to level up to improve their starting stats. The system is almost identical to Savage Empire, in that once a character hits a certain number of experience points, they will have a very specific dream when they next sleep. Sleeping is simply performed by having a tent in your inventory and using it, and can be done at any time to switch from night to day or vice versa. Sleeping will also heal the injured party members by a decent amount of health points, so I would recommend sleeping often. While you sleep, the character or characters that are able to level up will have a strange dream where they see 3 stone obelisks, each one inscribed with a symbol. These symbols are a book, a heart, and a sword, and represent intelligence, dexterity, and strength respectively. As I talked about in the combat section, there's absolutely no magic in Martian Dreams and no evidence that intelligence actually has a use, so never ever pick the book. The reference guide implies that it gives characters better awareness on how to use weapons or something, but if you just avoid giving your companions the shotgun, it probably won't matter. Dexterity is a useful stat because not only does it affect chance to hit in combat, but it also affects how far a character can move in their turn and how many turns they get in a round. This is especially critical if characters are wielding a melee weapon, so choose accordingly. Strength, on the other hand, governs combat damage dealt as well as carry capacity, meaning your party would benefit from high strength just to be able to carry around more tools and weaponry. Because you can basically ignore intelligence, it's pretty easy to level up strength and dexterity to maximum on pretty much your whole party by the end of the game. The other thing that happens when leveling up is characters will gain a bunch of extra hit points. Luckily, this means Nelly Bly won't stay so fragile forever, and even if for some reason you decided to put all your points into intelligence and dex, your party members will die less quickly as long as they continue to gain levels. After having rescued Cooter from his cave, you could go ahead and find the Oxygen blobs, but eventually we need to figure out how to get everyone off of Mars and back to Earth. If you talk to Dibs, he will tell you that after a few months on the surface of attempting to construct a new space cannon, the group ran out of iron to forge steel for the project. Thus, the expedition split into several groups. One led by Percival Lowell, who proposed the expedition in the first place, another by Jack Seagull, and a third by Rasputin. The problem is that each and every one of these groups is kind of a pain to deal with. Rasputin's is the worst, having sealed themselves off from anyone and staying extremely secretive. Jack Seagull's group has also closed the gates of their city. And last but not least, Lowell's group has gone completely mad. The only viable option at this point is to convince Seagull's group to let you into the city of Olympus. However, they don't trust anyone now, including Dibs, who used to live with them. In order to gain entrance, you will need to get a document signed by 3 people that the people of Olympus trust. Conveniently, there are 3 people from the city out exploring, looking for iron ore to mine for the cannon. The big question is, why has everyone gone mad and why don't they trust us? It turns out that the cities found across the world were already built when the explorers arrived, and inside each of them is advanced machinery. One of these is called a dream machine, and anyone who uses it starts acting like they are a Martian with no remembrance of who they really are. Although it's not immediately clear what's going on right now, restoring those affected to their sanity and learning why the dream machines have affected them in such a way will be one of our primary tasks. Traveling to the mine, we find 2 set explorers trapped behind a landslide, and of course the free member does not have a wrench to put the power drill together needed to free them. This is the first real example of using tools to solve problems in the game. Similar to the previous game Savage Empire, there's a variety of tools from tongs to weed sprayers that may seem like set dressing at first, but are actually needed to clear certain obstacles. They are not as heavily used as they were throughout the Savage Empire, for instance no more grenade making. Despite this, you will need them at multiple points throughout the story, and if you can spare the space and weight, you will almost certainly want to grab almost every tool you see, as having to travel all the way across the planets to grab the thingamabob you need to get something to work is kind of a pain. At one point you will need to use radioactive material to power a device, and if you attempt to handle it by hand or just leave it sitting in your inventory, the character carrying it will take radiation damage until they drop dead. Marie Curie will advise you to use rubber gloves and tongs to grab it, and to store any radium you find inside a lead box. Ironically, she ended up dying of radiation poisoning a few years later, so maybe she should have taken her own advice. In this case, you'll want to take the top part of the drill out of its box, and drop it on top of the bottom half. Then simply use the wrench on the drill and voila, the drill is put together. I wish my IKEA assembly was that easy. Once you have the drill assembled, you can simply move it onto the track, and drill out the trapped explorers. And now that all 3 of these explorers are together, they look pretty familiar. Yes, the explorers Yellen, Sherman, and Dupree are this game's versions of Yolo, Chamino, and Dupree, respectively. Even on Mars in the 19th century, we can't seem to get away from them. Sherman will actually offer to join you, and you might as well let him do so since his stats are pretty good and it doesn't hurt to have an extra person for combat. Upon receiving the signatures of the 3 explorers, you will be able to finally enter Olympus and talk to some of the figures. The citizens currently here include Teddy Roosevelt, Marie Curie, Thomas Edison, Admiral Perry, and several more. While it is really interesting to talk to them all and they all get really nice detail, our reason for coming to Mars was to rescue all of these people instead of chatting their ears off. Gibbs told us that Jack Seagull, another fictional character in this case, was the leader of the settlement at Olympus, and he will tell you that Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Steel is naturally heading up the effort to get a new space cannon built and return everyone home. So our next step is to head over to a different mine to talk to the man himself. At this point in the journey, we'll have explored quite a bit of Mars in order to get all the tools you need and get into the city of Olympus. And the one thing I started to feel was tedium. I think partially it had to do with all the red with little variety. Obviously it makes sense here because it is Mars, but Ultima 6 already had a pretty strong color red that appeared frequently. And here it's dialed up to 11 and starts to look pretty samey. I do think though that this consistent red background makes enemies, items, and locations stand out much more, as I did not notice sprites blending in with the background near as much as I did in Ultima 6 and the Savage Empire. It also gives this world a desolate, oppressive feel that's totally appropriate. The bigger problem with exploration at this point in the story is that there is absolutely no way to get anywhere except for walking. Not only do you need to walk from point A to point B, but there are massive canals that the Martians left behind, completely empty and uncrossable, except where there are bridges. And despite there being obvious bridges scattered all over the canals, only a few are actually extended, and whatever mechanism powers the bridge extension no longer seems to work. So you're stuck crossing only a few bridges and just shuffling around the sides of the canals to get to where you need to go. Luckily, in addition to bridges, there are a few spots where tunnels run underneath of the canals. In the case of getting over to Carnegie, there's a tunnel that runs from the west side of Olympus under the canal and over to the mine at Olympus Mons where Carnegie is working. When we reach him, he unfortunately does not really have any ideas on how to get more iron. He knows that the mine where Sherman, Yellen, and Dupree are working has plenty, but hasn't a clue how to transport it to Olympus, where the cannon is already under construction. He does suggest that we somehow get the electric system on the planet working. And although he doesn't really have a clue how to do this, Cooter actually gave us the location where we need to go to do this. Upon following Cooter's map to his stash, we find lots of mounds in the ground which can be dug up using a shovel to find large piles of oxium. However, nearby there is also a curious building, which just so happens to lead down into a large underground facility. Down in this facility, we find the first characters who were not members of either expedition, some robots that the Martians made to tend the facility. The 2 steampunk robots are Coker and Stoker, and they are in charge of moving coal to a conveyor belt and putting it into the boiler respectively. And yes, Mars is literally entirely steam-powered. The problem is that the conveyor belt is torn and broken, meaning that even if we could get the belt moving, it would quickly unravel and cease to function. Luckily, there is an ex-merchant marine in Olympus nearby who has the requisite experience in sewing up canvas items and is able to instantly repair it for you. Upon replacing this belt, Coker is able to start putting coal on it. Despite this, the system still needs a kickstart, which I found to be pretty finicky and not straightforward at all. To get the boiler started, you will need to find a small pile of coal, not one of the big lumps that Coker puts on the conveyor belt, and use a shovel on it to move it from one floor tile to the next. You will have to do this over and over again until you get it where it needs to go on the far other end of the room. As far as I could tell, you couldn't actually pick it up or move it in any other way, and I don't think the game actually tells you how to do this. It is, however, possible that I missed a piece of dialogue. Once you get a pile of coal into the furnace, the conveyor belt will begin to move, and Stoker will start to transport the large clumps of coal into it. However, the power is still not fully up, as the power transmission system seems to have gotten damaged in however long it's been since the Martians disappeared. In order to get the grid up and running again, you will have to go and collect a cable from another room in the steam plant basement, as well as make sure you have a pair of rubber gloves and pliers to avoid being electrocuted. There's some really funny dialogue written if you try to make your companions try to do this for you. Basically, they will throw a hissy and refuse, saying that you need to take that risk yourself. Spectre even uses some dialogue word for word from Blake 7.
What about you?
What about me?
Why don't you go?
You are expendable.
And you're not?
No, I'm not. I am not expendable, I'm not stupid, and I'm not going.
Someone at Origin really liked British sci-fi, and I'm here for it. Luckily, you don't die from doing this, and at last power will be restored to the entire Martian surface. That not only means that you can now extend bridges that were retracted before, but you also have access to a much quicker form of transportation, a tube system. Outside of each major city, there's a small outbuilding that contains 4 elevator-looking tubes. Once the power is restored, stepping into one will take you to another of the cities, as indicated in this chart. This makes it much quicker to cross the map, and helps to cut down on the amount of walking your party will need to do to get anywhere in the game. With the power back on and the tube system working, our party can now visit the cities of Elysium and Hellas to see if the citizens of Olympus are right about them. And as it turns out, they kinda are. All of them are extremely disheveled and messy when you try to talk to them, and call themselves weird names and claim that they're Martians, as well as calling you a worm at every opportunity. All of these maddened people reside in Elysium, whereas the sole resident of Hellas, Mad Marcus, is ironically the only one who isn't mad. He tells us that when they used the Dream Machine, their minds became trapped on another plane and actual Martians started using their bodies as their own. With this newly found information, it becomes obvious that our next step is to somehow follow these people into the realm of dreams and see what we can do to reverse their condition. The problem with this is that Seagull smashed up the machine in Olympus completely, and the human Martians won't give us access to the one in Elysium. The one in Hellas is also kind of broken, but it's really our only chance. If you use a Greenberry, you will be able to talk directly to the machine, which will reveal it needs new headgear, a new control panel, and a source of power. The power we can cover fairly easily by getting a piece of radium using the instructions that Marie Curie gives us as we talked about earlier. Getting the radium from caves is not exactly easy with the giant rockworms that it attracts, but that just provides us with free experience after all. The other 2 bits of machinery need to be retrieved from Olympus. The panel is fairly easy as there are several panels in the tunnel connecting the city to the mines under Olympus Mons, and Thomas Edison can retrofit one of these to be used for the Dream Machine. This quest is just one example of the different approach that Martian Dreams takes to its predecessor. While Savage Empire leaned heavily into the idea of using tools to make gadgets and solve problems, Martian Dreams heavily emphasizes its characters, making them your key source of not only information, but key skills to be used to overcome specific problems. In this case, it's Edison's knowledge of electronics that aids us, but in other cases it can be asking Admiral Perry about locations around the Martian surface, or using a person's interest in Martian trinkets to track down a key item. This game emphasizes the background and skills of almost all the members of the expeditions, and that will only be further leaned into with the upcoming sequences using the Dream Machine. Honestly, I think this was the perfect direction for a game that uses all these figures to go in. Instead of just having them be background or general set dressing, we actually use their skills and unique abilities to help progress the story. The last piece that we need to enter the world of dreams is the headgear from the Olympus Dream Machine. Jack Seagull has assigned a man named Legrand Colliard to guard the building containing the now destroyed machine. He, however, is concerned about his brother in the mines, and he will ask to go and check on him for you. When you discover his brother Jean on the brink of death, he hands you a Masonic symbol to return to Legrand and let him know of his fate. For this information, he will let you in to see the machine, and you can then remove the headgear for your own use. Once you return to Hellas and fix up the Dream Machine, you will be able to enter the Hall of Dreams, which is essentially just a white platform floating in the void, with 5 large obelisks to choose from. Touching any of these obelisks will have you transported to a different portion of the void. Each of these is a dream, or more aptly a nightmare, of someone who has been possessed by the Martians. Each nightmare ties directly to the figure and some aspect of them, and you must help them resolve the problems they face in order to free them. Only the Avatar is transported there, meaning that you must face all of the challenges alone. You also lose all of your gear and equipment while in the dream world, and thus have to just deal with what you can find there. Luckily, dying in the dreams just means waking up in the real world, and you can escape at any time by attempting to talk to yourself. There is also another set of dreams to go through in Elysium later on. While I won't go over each and every one of these dreams in detail, I will go into a few of them that I found to be particularly interesting. Probably the most interesting dream of the first batch is that of George Washington Carver. Carver was a real-life botanist and biologist who pioneered crop rotation, subsistence farming, and helped to popularize peanut butter. In his dream, he asks you to help him study the growth cycle of a Martian by planting a seed, watering it, and protecting it from worms that come to kill it. I found this to be a bit difficult for some reason, but as long as you just continue to pour water on it when in doubt and kill all the worms that come, it shouldn't be too hard.
Once the plant fully matures, you cut it open with a ritual knife, and instead of a Martian emerging, Carver himself falls out, freeing him from his nightmare. Another fun idea for a dream in this batch is the one for Lenin. Of course, Lenin is one of the leaders of the Russian Communist Revolution, so he makes you sort out a large amount of money and split it into equal piles to be distributed among the people. It's not a very difficult puzzle, but it is an interesting one. The money also doesn't divide evenly, so you end up with a little extra that Lenin takes back, quote, for the state to use for the benefit of the people, close quote. More like for the benefit of himself, but whatever. The most important dream in this haul is not one of the dreams of the people who have been possessed, but the dream where the Martian themselves are housed. Talking to these Martians, as well as those in Elysium who have been possessed, will start to unravel exactly what happened on Mars. They tell us that some centuries prior they were betrayed by a mad Martian named Raxachk. This Martian created a plague that not only killed their plant bodies, but destroyed their young as they grew. In order to survive, all the Martians that remained fled into the dream world and hoped that one day someone would arrive to save them. Thus, when the humans arrived, they found no Martians, but the remains of their cities left completely uninhabited. While some of the Martians were happy to use human bodies as a temporary solution, the leaders of the Hellas Grove desperately desired that they return to use the plant bodies that they were born in. In order to do this for them, we will have to return to the real world and see if we can grow new, healthy bodies for the Martians to use. After having explored the Dream Realms a bit, we will have heard most of the music that there is to hear in this game. Here's a sample of some of that music using the Roland MT32. Similar to the Savage Empire, this track list feels to me pretty repetitive and lacking in variety. In fact, I looked it up, and the soundtrack only consists of 8 tracks, and 3 of those seem to be exclusive to intro and outro cutscenes. I do think they set up a pretty good steampunk atmosphere, and the tracks that are there do complement the setting very well. I just wish there was a few more of them. I do disagree with the assertion that GreatestGameMusic.com gives, which claims that the soundtrack is, quote, the best Ultima score. I don't think it can even compare to Ultima 7 or either Underworld title for that claim, but I digress. Upon returning to the Land of the Living, our task will be to find all the appropriate materials to grow a Martian from scratch. These include a shovel, a viable seed, water, and the ingredients necessary to make fertilizer. Most of these are pretty easy to acquire. However, water does not seem to really be an easy to access thing on the Martian surface. Luckily for us, all we need to do is travel to one of the poles and cut out a chunk of ice. This ice can then be placed in a bucket, and upon returning to a more central latitude, it will melt and turn back into liquid water. Seeds are only available in one place on the entire planet, a storage unit in Hellas whose door has long since rusted shut. A small vial of oil is all that is needed to grease the door and get it to open, and inside there are several healthy seeds that can be used to start a new batch of Martian bodies. All that is left to be done at this point is to dig a hole, put the seed in it, cover it up, add water, and add the fertilizer ingredients. From here it will take 9 in-game days to grow, and while it won't need constant vigilance, you will need to visit a few times to make sure it continues to progress. There isn't that much to do besides wait, So if you are low on supplies or ammo, you can spend this time stocking back up. Of course, that will probably only end up taking maybe 2 or 3 in-game days, so you can just use the tent to pass the time until the Martian plant is fully ripened. As we saw in the dream with George Washington Carver, you will need to cut the pod open to retrieve the body. At this point, you can re-enter the Hellas Dream Machine and talk to their leader, Praktesh, to let him know of your success. He will insist on being the first one to return to a body to ensure it is safe, and upon placing the Martian body in the machine and using the panel, the body will spring to life. Praktesh is ecstatic that it has seemed to work, and insists upon getting right to work to grow more. Unluckily for him, the moment you try to exit the conversation, he starts coughing and feeling extremely sick. As it turns out, while the plague seems to have died in the air long ago, it somehow survived dormant within the soil, and thus no new healthy plant bodies can possibly be grown on Mars. Although the death of Praktesh seems to signal the doom of the Martian race, all hope is not lost. The Hellas arborist Saktesh was working on an alternative solution to create bodies that would resist the effects of the plague. Speaking to her reveals that her podmate had been working on producing robot bodies that they could inhabit to resist the plague. However, the only way to access that lab is to get under the North Pole ice cap, and the only people on Mars who can possibly help us do that are those afflicted with madness in Elysium. Upon returning to Elysium, you can talk to Percival Lowell, currently possessed by the Martian leader, Tekapesh. He will seem sorrowful that the plan to plant new bodies has failed, and will allow the party to access their dream machine and free the rest of the dreamers, after which they will leave the bodies of the humans who came to Mars. So here we are presented with another set of dreams, of which I will explain just a snapshot for brevity's sake. One of the more noticeable dreams in this set is that of Wyatt Earp, famous American lawman who fought in the shootout at the OK Corral. In his dream there is an ongoing auction for several horses. One of these is Earp himself, who has been transformed into a grey horse and is in danger of being bought by his long-time outlaw enemy, Ike Clanton. Another horse in this auction is the infamous Smith the Horse. Starting all the way back in Ultima 4, Smith has appeared and given the Avatar hints to help them along their journey. However, in his first appearance, his dialogue tree was incomplete, meaning he did not give the player the hint that they were supposed to. Since then, he has provided hints, but only ones that pertain to the previous game as a way of making a joke out of his initial forgetfulness of the clue. Here, Smith provides similarly unhelpful. If bought, he immediately says he isn't grateful for you buying him, and won't carry anything for you. Upon being asked for clues, he gives us clues for both the Savage Empire and Ultima 6, telling us how to access the underground city and make the hot air balloon in the 2 adventures respectively. Of course, you aren't actually meant to buy him, so if you do, you will have to start the dream over and outbid Ike Clanton for the Grey Horse. Upon winning him, he will thank you for your help and be freed from his nightmare. The other dream here that is notable is really notable for just being annoying. This dream concerns the filmmaker George Méliès, and he is trapped in a room that shrinks whenever you move and has a door that is completely rusted shut. The key to this one is to try to only step on the blue tiles, as stepping on these prevents the room from shrinking. Thought this was impossible for the longest time, as the proper path involves doing a diagonal move, which I didn't realize you could actually do. However, once you find the pattern, you're able to move to one end, grab some dream stuff, and return to him without the room killing you. I realize that throughout all these dreams so far I've not talked about dream stuff. Dream stuff is a substance found only in the dream world, that when used can transform into whatever item is needed at that moment. It's not super powerful and the item spawns all appear to be predetermined, but it does play a key role in most of the dreams and thus is important to know about. In this case, when used it simply turns into a flask of oil, which then can be used to open up the rusty door and escape the room. While doing my research for this video, one of the most interesting design documents I found involved the dream segments for the game. Although a lot of interesting and creative dreams were in the final product, there appear to have been ideas for at least 22 of them. I will describe some of the ones that appear to have ended up getting cut at various stages of production. One of these cut dreams would have been a different version for Percival Lowell's nightmare. The cut version is described as follows. Quote, "The Avatar appears in a classroom that is full of desks with nowhere to sit. The teacher implores that they are late and that they must now take a final exam. The Avatar is given a test, which is comprised of copy protection questions they must get right or be kicked out and repeat the dream. If the test is passed, the Avatar is accused of cheating and must see the principal. When he goes to the principal, there is Lowell, who complains that since the Avatar cheated off his paper, they will both fail and be doomed to having no reasonable future. Lowell wants to avert this fate by waiting in the hall as long as possible. Only when made to confront the fear of failure by stepping through the principal's door to demonstrate that Lowell will not become an eternal failure will the Avatar wake up from the dream." Another cut dream would have involved an evil Lord British, who would have trapped you in the dream world, forcing you to kill him to escape. I found all of these cut dream ideas fascinating, and it's interesting to think what the game would have looked like if they had been included alongside or instead of the existing ones. Once all of the dreamers across both Hellas and Elysium have been freed, the Martians will agree to relinquish their bodies, upon the condition that we work quickly to find them new ones. Once this is done, we will have restored most of the 1893 expedition to sanity, and can thus start on the work of uncovering the Martian lab and finishing their work. As with everything else on Mars at this point, the equipment for melting the ice at the North Pole is in pretty bad disrepair. The system consists of 3 towers which use giant lenses to melt the ice, however one of them has a busted motor, one a broken lens, and one is completely overgrown with plant life. The repairs for each of these 3 towers are fairly simple. The plants can be cleared away through use of a weed sprayer which can be found in many locations on the planet. The broken lens can be repaired by the famed stained glass maker Louis Tiffany, who resides in Elysium, and the motor can be repaired by Edison. At this point it feels like the game is slighting Tesla in favor of Edison as much as the real world did. Taking these parts and returning them to their respective towers will allow the system to be started up again, which simply requires an entry of the current in-game time at a control panel to calibrate the lenses. Once this is done, the lab will be opened to us and we can begin the process of bringing the Martians back to life. Upon entering and exploring the underground lab, the party will discover a mechanical woman sitting on a table, clearly inoperative at this point in time. Luckily, in another room in the facility, there is one of the Martian robot workers named Cutter, who will inform you that if you find him a gem of azurite, he will be able to make it into a heartstone, which is the piece needed to be able to store a Martian mind. So off we go to see if we can find a piece of azurite anywhere in this large world. Luckily, or unluckily as it may be, seemingly the only piece of azurite in all of Mars is in the possession of William Randolph Hearst, and of course he has us do yet another silly task before he will give it to us. Apparently Hearst sent someone up Olympus Mons, which just so happens to be the tallest peak in the entire solar system, to take a picture of the new space cannon being built for his newspaper when he gets back home. The man has long since not returned, and of course all he really wants is for us to bring him the photo back. He really could not care any less about the man who took it, whether he is alive or dead. And as tempting as it is to kill him here on the spot, the game will not let you save if you kill an NPC, so we actually have to do this task for the jerk. Luckily Olympus Mons is not that difficult to climb, and after fighting off a few proto-Martians, you will find the dead body of the man he sent to take the picture, as well as the camera resting a few feet away. All that needs to be done to get the finished photo is to take it to the now restored Georges Méliès, who will develop it for us. We don't even get to see the finished photo, but at least Hearst gives us the gem in return. Upon taking the stone to Cutter, he can fashion it into the heartstone we need, which we can then place into the metal body. All that is left to do is to take it to the Dream Machine, where similarly to before, a Martian conscious will be placed into it. This time the Martian who possesses the body is the one-time Hellas ambassador, Cheshket. I think that's how you pronounce her name. And the metal body is quite immune from any plague effects that plant bodies would have been subject to. She will join your party, and if you are at the game's limit of 5 party members, someone will leave so she can join. Probably Sherman at this point, as everyone else refuses to leave. As a party member, not only is she extremely strong and durable, but she can also withstand hot steam jets, allowing her to enter areas the party previously could not pass through. With Chesket now proving that the Martians can survive inside metal bodies, they will set to the task of creating more for the other Martians to inhabit. Though if Hearst was the only one we could find with an azurite gem, I'm not sure how well that's going to work out for them. Anyways, the Martians have decided it is best to return to Earth with us, as Mars is completely devastated by the plague at this point, and I guess they would get a bit lonely with no new Martians being born.
They would, however, cause quite a stir on Earth as metal people, and will need a way to blend in. There is a machine that can cover them in a rubber skin of sorts, and the skin can be colored using berries found in Argyre. That plan will have to wait, however, as Rasputin has completely sealed off the city with no obvious way to get in. For now, we turn back to the most major task, finding an iron supply for Carnegie to finish the space cannon. The mine that Dupree, Yellen, and Sherman were exploring proved to have large caches of iron ore. However, there is at the moment no viable way of transporting it from there to the site at Olympus Mons. There does, however, appear to be a barge in one of the canals that can carry a minecart, and if the canals could be refilled with water, then perhaps it could be used to do so.
Fortunately for the humans stranded on Mars, we already had to reactivate the ice melting machinery in order to gain access to the robot lab. Unfortunately, however, it does not seem to have refilled the canals. This is due to the fact that the water pumping station is shut off.
and the only way to get to the valve is past the hot steam vents that would kill any human. Luckily, Chesket can withstand such temperatures, and is able to pass through in solo mode and turn the extremely rusted valve in order to get the canals flowing once again. And just like that, there is finally a bit better way to get around Mars. Still kind of tedious, but better. Oh, and even though water is now flowing on Mars, I wouldn't recommend drinking it. Just don't do it.
Don't even touch it, not one drop.
In order to use the canals, you will need to grab one of 4 barges scattered about the planet. To use a barge, you simply get on one, and then use the lever on board, moving it in the direction you wish to go. It will lock in this direction until you either change it or it can't go any further, so be careful not to get off and let it leave you behind. You will also need to retract any bridges that block your path while going, but that is fairly simple to do. 2 of these are just regular average sized barges that you can navigate around without touching either side and thus mostly avoid combat. There are occasionally giant canal worms that come up and block your path, so you will have to deal with those. I don't really understand how they survived the canals being dry for centuries. I mean, they're not sandworms, but whatever. There is also one small barge near Argyre that has a cannon on it, and a large one with minecart tracks and lots of cannons. This is the one we will want to use to get iron ore from the Syrtis Major mines to Olympus Mons. Getting this large barge to the mine is a bit of a pain because it is so large it will always be touching one of the sides of the canal, meaning I often got forced into combat with easy to kill but annoying creatures such as the creeping cactus and jumping beans, which in effect just served to make barge transport feel even more tedious than walking at certain times. I had really gotten used to taking the tube to move quicker between major locations at this point, so it became kind of a bit of a pain. Once I got the barge over to the iron mines, I noticed another serious problem. Yellen seems to insist on blocking the minecart tracks, and no matter what I did, I could not seem to get him to move out of the way. I eventually had to resort to attacking him, and on my first go around I ended up killing him completely. This popped up a message saying that I killed someone whose help I needed to win the game. Kind of like those thread of prophecy severed messages in Morrowind, I guess. I don't think he was that helpful, and in fact he was actively keeping me from doing my quest. But the game wouldn't let me save. So I had to resort to regathering all of the iron I needed into the cart, and then attacking him and running away before he could follow and kill me. This way he would survive, and I would also be able to get the loaded minecart through. Upon taking this iron to Carnegie, he will send more men to fetch as much iron as possible, and asks if you can retrieve the propellant needed from the 1893 capsule so that they can make the return trip. Upon going to retrieve it, we find that the entire cache has been stolen. I'm unsure why the 1893 capsule would have enough for a round-trip journey and the 1895 capsule would not, but I guess we have to have some sort of endgame conflict. Teddy Roosevelt will be able to inspect some trace evidence left behind to discover fingerprints of the culprit. And as expected, the propellant phlogistonite, which is definitely a made-up word, has been stolen by Rasputin, leader of the humans of Argyre. In fact, Rasputin was the one who was determined to have set off the 1893 capsule early in the first place. With this information in hand, it is finally time to breach the walls of Argyre and face down the person responsible for us having to come here in the first place. The small barge with the cannon can get close up enough to shoot the walls, but traditional lead cannonballs are too soft to possibly penetrate them. Luckily for us, we know a man that is well versed in steel making, and with a new supply of steel. Andrew Carnegie will gladly fashion some steel cannonballs for us, allowing us to finally enter the last major city and meet the remaining characters. Exploring the city of Argyre will reveal the largest stash of ammo and weapons anywhere in the game, which is kind of frustrating considering that any major combat is basically behind us at this point. There are also a few characters to talk to, but for the most part they are not historical figures and thus uninteresting. There are 2 people we will want to talk to, however. One of these is Emma Goldman, a real-life anarchist who surprisingly was not possessed by an evil Martian, but was convinced to follow them just because she loves chaos and hates Carnegie that much. Rasputin, on the other hand, is a different story. As much as Rasputin seems to have had a hand in getting the expedition into the mess they are, using the Dream Machine in Argyre made him much worse. Awaiting him in the Dream Realm was the Martian who caused the extinction of their race in the first place, Raxachk. Upon talking to Rasputin's Raxachk, he will reveal who he is, and taunt you by telling you he has transported the phlogistonite itself to the Dream World, and that if you attempt to remove it, a great cataclysm will be the result. In reaction to this information, Chesket will tell you that you must retrieve the rest of our people from the void before even trying to do such a thing. Luckily for us, the last material we need to make this happen is available to us now in Argyre. Upon collecting some of these flesh-colored berries and taking them to Sarah Bernhardt, she will make us a nice flesh-colored dye. Using this in the sprayer machine will make Chesket appear as a human woman. But not just any woman, it's the woman from the opening of the game. Thus one of the major parts of the paradox is completed, allowing her to one day appear to you with the information that will bring you back to 1895 and then Mars. With the Martians now able to be freed and blend in with the human populace, we can turn our attention to retrieving the propellant from the dream world. Upon the party's return to ActRaiser, you will find that everyone has been killed outside of Goldman and Rasputin. A distressed Goldman tells us that Raxachk murdered everyone in the town, and then forced her to operate the dream machine so he could enter, presumably to protect the Phlogistonite from us. Rasputin, on the other hand, seems dazed and confused, revealing that while on Earth he received dreams and visions of Mars, and was tempted there by Raxachk with the promise of power to rule the planet. Well, with that last question answered, only one path remains, through the dream machine and into the realm of Raxachk himself. Upon entering the ActRaiser dream machine, the Avatar finds themselves not in the dreams of someone else, but their own nightmares. These dreams are run by the Shadow Lords we defeated back in Ultima 5, the shades of falsehood, hatred, and cowardice respectively. All three tests are fairly simple. The test of falsehood requires you to decide which of two Dr. Spectres is real, the test of hatred helps you cure a hateful Martian's heart, and the test of cowardice pushes you to the brink of death in combat. After having passed these tests, you will be brought to the realm of Raxachk, who gets this really cool Rasputin Martian fusion portrait. Honestly, one of the coolest pieces of art in the entire game. Anyway, through conversation with him, he says he would give you back the propellant on condition that you were able to beat 3 challenges he places before you. These challenges are fairly simple combat trials, each a little more difficult than the last. As you don't take any of your inventory with you, you will need to use the quantities of dream stuff you find to create weapons and ammo. There are also berries you will need to grab, including brown ones that show the invisible creature in the last trial, allowing you to kill it. Of course, on completion on the trials, Raxachk immediately reneges on his promise, and brags that no weapon could possibly be fashioned by humans for over 100 years to breach the fortress he has built around him. So first off, he should have realized that the Avatar is from about 100 years in the future, considering that he says his mind is an open book to be read. However, he is mostly right to be confident, as it seems that the large pile of dream stuff is hoarded behind a steel door with no way to open it. Luckily, through the use of brown berries to peer through walls and purple berries for telekinesis, we can see that there's a switch inside the small room and flip it. Using multiple pieces of dream stuff, you're able to start with a small weapon and slowly build up to larger and more powerful ones, until you finally come up with something that will certainly humble Raxachk that he could not possibly have accounted for, an M60 machine gun.
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
Now this does mean his math was a little bit off, as the M60 entered service in 1957, a mere 60 years on from this adventure. But I'll just put that down to his pride. The Avatar shoots the Mad Martian with an M60 machine gun, rounding off one of the most wild games I've ever played. Upon killing Raxachk, we load the propellant back onto a device that will send it to the real world. This of course has the cataclysmic effect that was predicted. So all that is left to do upon waking up is grab the canisters, take a quick ride to Olympus, and jump on the space cannon. Talking to Carnegie will then trigger the ending cutscene. The entirety of both expeditions, as well as all of the disguised Martians, load onto the capsule. After a several-month-long journey, the expedition splashes down on Earth, somehow surviving re-entry, are paraded as heroes, and take one last photo to commemorate. A photo that will be given to the Avatar almost a century later. And the last lines of the cutscene answer Spectre's question about how this could possibly be the same Mars as observed by NASA. The quakes and storms caused by our actions wipe away the last traces of Martian civilization and render it fully uninhabitable. And that's it for Martian Dreams. The credits roll without as much as a congrats for beating our game screen, which I think makes this the only Ultima without one. Although 9 may not have one, but I haven't beaten it before. Overall, this game was a really fun experience. It was a bit tedious at times, and some things could have been better, but the ideas were extremely wrong and fairly well executed, with some good music and great artwork to mark my progress throughout. One element that I do wish was part of this game and its predecessor to a greater degree was the strong moral focus of Ultimas 4 through 6. In my mind, this focus on morals and virtues is what sets the Ultima series in general apart from other RPGs, and getting to see it in a different setting than Britannia could have been very interesting. Ultima 6 gave us a peek at this with the alternate virtue system the Gargoyles had, but I would have also loved to see it here as well. Overall, I don't really think there's another game like it out there, and it certainly makes for a good final entry in the Worlds of Ultima spin-off series. Getting to meet lots of famous turn-of-the-century figures while also fighting Martians? Sign me up. At the low price of $3.99,
I couldn't recommend it enough, and I'm happy to have it on my shelf physically alongside the rest of the Ultima series. Thanks so much to everyone who watched this and has stuck with my channel. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, subscribe, or even share it with others who might also enjoy it. I hope to have more of these videos for you soon, and I also hope that you all have a great rest of your week.